He thought he was just dropping his daughter off at the shelter. A Saturday errand. The kind that ends in 40 minutes and leaves no mark on a man. But when the door swung open and the smell of clean hay and disinfectant hit him, 2 dogs at the far end of the hallway stopped everything he had planned for the rest of his life. One came running. The other did not move at all. By nightfall, Owen Calloway would understand that he had not chosen either of them. They had already chosen him. And the one he almost left behind would teach him something the wars never could. The drive from Kelowna to the SPCA satellite shelter outside West Kelowna took 22 minutes on a clear October morning, and Owen drove it the way he drove everything these days. Hands steady, face forward, radio off. The Okanagan hills rose copper and rust on both sides of the highway, the maples stripped to their bones by the early frost. The sky the particular shade of gray that British Columbia wears in autumn like an old coat it never quite takes off. At 51, Owen Calloway was the kind of man who filled a doorway without trying. Broad through the chest and shoulders, built by decades of military discipline that had not softened much in the years since he left the service. His hair, once dark brown, had gone silver at the temples and all the way through at the sides, worn short from habit more than preference. His jaw carried a few days of gray growth, and his eyes were a pale, serious green. The color of lake water before a storm rolls in from the mountains. He had been a Navy SEAL for 19 years. Before that, he had been a boy from Prince Edward Island who believed that silence and endurance were the same thing as strength. He still believed that, mostly. Some things were harder to unlearn than the men who had trained him would have expected. Beside him in the passenger seat sat his daughter, Nora Calloway. 29, slight and dark-haired like her mother, with her mother's habit of talking through her hands and her father's stubborn jaw. She had driven from Vancouver 3 days ago with a suitcase and a plan, the plan being that Owen needed to stop eating canned soup alone in a house that had gone too quiet. The suitcase suggested she intended to enforce this. Nora had recently convinced herself, through some combination of internet research and daughterly willpower, that what her father needed was a dog. Owen had told her twice that he did not need a dog. Nora had made an appointment at the shelter anyway. "You don't have to go in with an open mind," she said now, studying the directions on her phone. "You just have to go in." "I'm going in," Owen said, "with your face like that." "My face is fine, Dad. Your face looks like you're approaching a hostile structure." He said nothing. She was not entirely wrong. The shelter sat back from the road on a gravel lot, a low beige building with a hand-painted mural of dogs and cats along one exterior wall, slightly faded from the summers. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic and cedar shavings, and the particular warmth of too many living things in a carefully maintained space. A bulletin board near the entrance was covered in photos of adopted animals beside their new families, dogs in backyards, cats on laps, one tortoise-shell perched improbably on a man's shoulder like a small orange parrot. Owen put his hands in the pockets of his field jacket and read the bulletin board without meaning to. Old habit. Assess before entering. The volunteer at the desk, a young man named Patrick with a shaved head and a vest covered in enamel pins, greeted Nora warmly and led them toward the dog wing. Owen followed at a measured distance, cataloging exits, corners, the placement of the cameras above the kennel doors. He could not turn this off. He had tried. They were walking past a row of kennels when Patrick unlatched a half door at the end of the corridor to let 2 dogs into the hallway for a greeting visit. The first one arrived like a small weather event. He was a 10-week-old border collie mix, mostly black and white, with 1 brown ear and 1 white ear and a tail that had not stopped moving since birth. He hit Owen's boot at full speed, bounced backward, regrouped, and launched himself at the bootlace with the focused intensity of a creature who had decided this was the most important task of his young life. His name, according to the tag on his kennel door, was Banjo. He had been found under a hay baler on a property near Summerland with his brother, no mother in sight, no explanation offered by the universe. Owen looked down at Banjo. Banjo growled magnificently at the bootlace. "He does that to everyone," Patrick said. "I can see that." Nora was already crouching with her hand out, laughing as Banjo abandoned the lace to investigate her sleeve. "Oh, he's ridiculous. Dad, look at him." Owen had already looked. He was looking at the other dog. The second one had not moved from the wall. He was Banjo's littermate, same age, same unknown heritage, but leaner through the frame and darker. Mostly black with a faint rust coloring at the paws and eyebrows. His name on the kennel tag was Bear. He stood with his back close to the wall, ears half raised, watching the corridor with an attention that seemed too deliberate for a 10-week-old puppy. He did not bark. He did not wag. He tracked Owen's movements with amber eyes that held a steadiness uncommon in young animals. The kind of steadiness that was not calm at all, but the closest thing to calm that fear had managed to build. Something in Owen's chest went still. The shelter manager stepped out from a side office. She was a woman of about 45 named Cora Devlin, red-haired and unhurried, wearing a navy shelter fleece over mud-stained jeans. She had the particular quality of people who spent their days with frightened animals. A quietness in her hands, a patience in the way she occupied a room without demanding it notice her. "Banjo makes friends in about 4 seconds, Cora said, watching Owen watch Bear. "Bear's a different story, different how," Owen said, not quite a question. Cora tilted her head toward the darker puppy. "Banjo runs at the world. Bear's been trying to figure out whether the world is safe." She said it without sentiment. That was what made it land. "They came in together," she continued. "We don't know what happened before. Whatever it was, Bear got more of it. He eats when Banjo eats, sleeps when Banjo sleeps. Won't take food from a hand yet." She paused. "The shelter's at capacity. If we can't place them together by end of this week, we'll have to separate them. Banjo has interest from 2 families. Bear doesn't have any." The hallway felt suddenly smaller. Banjo was now attempting to drag Nora's shoelace out of her shoe. Nora was letting him, her face bright with the uncomplicated joy of someone who still believed the world could be simple if you loved it correctly. Bear stood at the wall, watching Owen. "I don't have a dog," Owen said. Cora did not argue. She just looked at him with the steady patience of someone who had heard that sentence many times before, from many men who had left the shelter with a dog. Outside, rain had started to come in off the lake, tapping against the shelter windows in the quiet, persistent way of Pacific Northwest weather that doesn't ask if you're ready. Inside, Banjo sneezed on Nora's knee, and Bear stood very still at the edge of the corridor, and Owen Calloway, who had survived things he still did not say aloud, felt something old and sealed shift inside him like ice at the start of a thaw. He did not know what it was yet. He only knew that the drive home already felt like a retreat. Owen did not take the highway directly home. He took the lake road instead, which added 15 minutes and went past the orchards, and he told himself it was because the traffic was better. Nora, who knew him well enough to understand that lake roads were where Owen went to think, said nothing and looked at the water. She had stayed quiet for almost 4 minutes, which was something like a personal record. "He looked at you the whole time," she said finally. "Dogs look at people. It's what they do. Not like that." Nora turned from the window. Banjo looked at everybody. Bear looked at you. Owen kept his eyes on the road. The Okanagan in October was all muted gold and rust, the vineyards stripped, the hills across the lake wearing their autumn colors, like they were too tired to take them off. He had moved here 3 years ago after Margaret died, because the island was full of things that still had her shape. The garden, the kitchen window, the particular quality of a summer afternoon that she had loved. He had told himself British Columbia was practical. New territory, better for a man who needed to stop carrying the same views. He had not stopped carrying anything. He had just moved it somewhere with better mountains. His house was 40 minutes outside Kelowna, up a side road through pine and fir, a 2-bedroom timber frame that he had bought for its distance from neighbors and its view of the ridge. It was clean, organized, almost institutional, boots by the door, coffee tin on the counter, 1 plate in the drying rack. Margaret would have had flowers somewhere. She always put flowers somewhere, even in winter, even from the grocery store, even just 3 stems in a jar, because she said a house needed something alive in it. There were no flowers. Nora had commented on this once, then let it go, which was the wisest thing she had ever done. That evening, Owen made dinner from what was in the kitchen, which turned out to be eggs and toast, and last night's coffee reheated in a way that would have distressed anyone who cared about coffee. Nora ate it without complaint, which said a great deal about how worried she was about him. They sat at the kitchen table, and the house was quiet around them in the way houses became quiet when they had gotten used to only one person moving through them. "I'm not lonely," Owen said, into the silence. Nora looked at him over her mug. "I'm not," he said. "I know that's what you think. I didn't say that. You drove 6 hours to take me to a dog shelter, Nora." She wrapped both hands around the mug. "Bear would sleep most of the day. He wouldn't ask you to talk about your feelings. He'd just, 'Don't, Dad,' I said, 'don't.'" Nora looked at the table for a moment, and Owen recognized the expression because he had seen it on her mother too, the look of a person deciding whether to push or let the river find its own course. Margaret had been patient that way. She had let him come back from the hard places in his own time, never dragging, never abandoning. Just present. Like a lamp left on in a window, he went to bed without settling anything, which was, in its way, already an answer. He woke at 3 in the morning, as he often did, and lay in the dark listening to the pines. In the deployments, he had learned to sleep anywhere and to wake to anything, and that second skill had never turned off, even here, even in the quiet. Sometimes what woke him was noise. Sometimes it was the absence of it. Sometimes it was just the old habit of his nervous system refusing to believe the night was safe. He thought about Bear's eyes, the steadiness in them that was not calm. The way the puppy had stood against the wall with his body tightly held, watching. Not because he was aggressive, not because he was bold, but because watching was the only thing he trusted enough to do. Owen knew that posture. He had taken it in airports, in grocery stores, in his brother-in-law's crowded living room at Christmas 2 years ago, in the hollow that opened up in him at large gatherings since the deployment he did not discuss. Always the wall, always the sight line to the door. Always the face arranged into something that passed for ordinary. He lay there in the dark for a while, not sleeping. Then he reached for his phone. There was a message from a contact he had not saved under a name, just a number, which turned out to be Cora Devlin from the shelter. Nora had apparently given his number to her before they'd even left, which was either thoughtful or an act of war depending on how you looked at it. The message was a photo. No explanation. Just the photo Bear, curled in the far corner of a kennel on a blue blanket, his dark back pressed to the wall, his muzzle between his paws, his amber eyes open and fixed on something beyond the frame. Not asleep, not quite awake. Suspended the way a person sometimes got suspended between one kind of life and another. Banjo was asleep across him, sprawled like a dropped coat, head tucked under Bear's chin. Bear's chin rested on his brother's back. Even in stillness, they were keeping each other warm. Owen looked at the photo for a long time. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He was at the shelter when it opened at 8 in the morning. Cora was already there, coffee in hand, as though she had expected this. She did not make a comment about it, which Owen appreciated more than he could reasonably express. She simply got the paperwork. Nora arrived 20 minutes later, slightly out of breath, still in her coat, having received a text from Owen that said only shelter opens at 8, "You should probably be here," which was, by Owen Calloway standards, a fairly open declaration of surrender. The adoption papers were 3 pages. Owen signed each one with the careful attention he gave a binding document. 2 dogs, to be kept together, medical history, food instructions, the number for the emergency vet in Kelowna. Cora slid 2 collars across the desk when it was done, one orange, one dark green. Banjo got the orange one because nothing about him had ever suggested restraint. Bear got the green one, and when Owen knelt to fasten it, the puppy held very still and watched his hands with enormous concentration, not frightened exactly, but not trusting yet either, extending something that was almost trust, the way a person extends a hand in a place where they have been hurt before. "Easy," Owen said quietly. "Nobody's in a rush." Bear did not move, but his tail shifted once against the floor. Nora made a sound from across the lobby that she would later claim was not crying. The drive back up the lake road was different from the drive down. Banjo made his opinion of car travel known at considerable length, bouncing from one side of the back seat to the other, pressing his nose to the window, fogging it with breath, attempting to reach the gear shift, stepping on Nora's phone, and distributing a quantity of black and white fur across every surface he touched. He was, Owen concluded, going to be an enormous amount of work. Bear sat upright on the seat and did not move. He watched the road through the windshield with that same focused attention, his dark head slightly raised, ears half lifted, cataloging the world as it passed. When the road curved up into the pines and the lake disappeared behind the tree line, Bear turned and looked at Owen. Owen glanced in the rearview mirror. Bear held the look for 2 full seconds, then turned back to the windshield. Owen was not entirely sure what had just happened, but something about it settled in him like a stone finding the bottom of still water. The first week was instructive. Banjo declared war on the field jacket hanging by the door. He lost, but came back 3 times, which suggested he either had no memory or too much character. He upended his water bowl twice, found a way to wedge himself behind the washing machine, and could not get out, and developed a passionate and unrequited interest in a red throw cushion that he carried around the house like a trophy, whose significance only he understood. Owen bought a better water bowl. He moved the cushion. He did not raise his voice. Bear stayed near the walls. He ate after Banjo ate, choosing the moment when Banjo's attention was occupied elsewhere, as though needing food was something he preferred to do privately. He slept in the far corner of the living room, facing the door. He did not seek Owen out. He allowed Owen to move through the house without flinching, which was its own kind of progress. Owen learned quickly not to approach Bear from above or from behind. He learned to crouch instead of bend, to extend a hand low and wait rather than reach. He learned that Bear would sometimes come within a foot of him, stop, look carefully at Owen's face, and then retreat, as if checking something he wasn't ready to confirm. Owen understood the checking. He did not rush it. Cora Devlin had given him her number for follow-up questions, and he used it more than he expected. She came by once in the second week, driving up the Pine Road in a battered Subaru, wearing the same navy fleece and a wool hat. She stood in the kitchen and watched Bear move along the baseboard of the living room and said nothing for a while. "He's mapping it," she said eventually. "I know." She looked at Owen. "You've been letting him. There's no rush," Owen said, which was something he had said to Bear 3 days ago from across the kitchen and meant in a way he had not fully examined. Cora drank the coffee he made her and asked questions about Bear's eating and sleeping, and Owen answered them. And at some point the conversation moved from the dogs to the house itself, and he found himself telling her that he'd moved here 3 years ago, that he'd been in Victoria before that his wife had liked the idea of the West Coast, but they'd never quite made it there together. He stopped. He had not meant to say any of that. Cora did not fill the silence with anything. She just held her mug and looked at the window, which framed a gray October sky above the ridge, and the absence of pressure in her silence made it possible for Owen to remain in the room without needing to leave it. "She would have liked this place," he said after a while. "Margaret?" He had apparently said her name before and not noticed. He nodded once. Cora looked at Bear, who had found the narrow gap between the sofa and the bookcase and was lying there in the way that small animals lay in places where they could see everything without being seen. "Sometimes animals understand the shape of a room better than people do," she said. "They can tell where the grief is." Owen looked toward the hallway. At the far end of it was a closed door he did not look at often. He said nothing. Cora did not push. The night it changed was a Tuesday in November. Banjo had finally exhausted himself, an event that arrived around 10 in the evening like a small miracle, and was asleep on his back in the middle of the living room rug, paws loose, expression beatific. The fire had burned down to coals. Owen sat in the chair with a book open on his knee that he had not read a word of for 20 minutes. The house settled and creaked around him in the wind, and he was aware, as he always was on these nights, of the door at the end of the hallway. He had been aware of it since Margaret died. He had been particularly aware of it since coming to this house, which was of course why he had chosen a room for storage, and not looked at it long enough to call it anything else. When Bear vanished, Owen noticed the way he always noticed missing things. Not with alarm, not immediately, but with a shift in the quality of the air. Banjo's breathing filled one corner of the room. Bear's watchfulness had filled another. Now that corner was empty. Owen found him at the end of the hallway. The puppy was lying directly in front of the closed door. Not scratching, not whining. Chin on his paws, amber eyes open, waiting with the patience of a creature who had learned that sometimes the right thing to do was simply remain. Owen stopped several feet away. The back of his throat tightened. "That's not a room," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. Bear lifted his head, looked at Owen. Owen stood there in the hallway for a long time, the wind pressed against the house. Somewhere on the ridge, a branch came down through the dark. He put his hand on the door. Inside, the room smelled of old paper and cedar, and the particular silence of things that have not been touched for a long time. A moving box against one wall, Margaret's quilting frame folded against the other, the one she had not had time to set up again before the diagnosis, before the 18 months that followed, before the morning in February when Owen sat beside her in the hospital and held her hand until her breathing changed. A box of her books, still taped, a winter coat on a hook that he had not been able to give away. And on the shelf above the window her photographs. Her mother, her sister, their daughter at 17, squinting into a Vancouver Island summer, and Margaret herself in the one he loved best, standing in a garden somewhere he couldn't remember now, laughing at something outside the frame, completely unaware she was being captured. Owen sat down on the floor of that room. He did not know quite when he decided to do it. His back went against the wall, his knees bent up, and he sat in the half-dark with the door open behind him. Bear walked in. He did not explore the room. He came to Owen's side and sat down, his small dark body pressing its warmth against Owen's arm, his amber eyes resting on the middle distance, not looking at the photographs, not looking at Owen, just present in the unhurried way of animals who understand that some things do not need to be solved, only witnessed. Owen looked at the photograph on the shelf. The grief came the way it always came, not like a wave, not like they said in the things people said, but like pressure behind the eyes, like something enormous and patient finally being acknowledged. He did not sob. He simply sat in the closed room that he had been unable to enter for 3 years and let it be what it was. His hand found the top of Bear's head. The dog went very still beneath it, the way a person went still when they understood that stillness was the help being asked for. From the living room, Banjo snored once, deeply, and then went quiet. Owen stayed on the floor of the room until the pressure eased, which took a long time, and the whole while Bear did not move. Winter came early to the Okanagan that year, the kind of early that catches the valley in the middle of its last golden weeks and turns them, overnight, to ice. This fell on a Thursday evening, and by Friday morning the pine road to Owen's house had 2 feet of it, and the ridge was gone behind white. Banjo stood on the porch and stared at the world with the expression of a dog discovering that outside had been fundamentally reorganized overnight. Bear stood beside him and watched the tree line. Owen had learned, in the weeks since the night in the storage room, that Bear watched things the way Owen watched things, not nervously, not aggressively, with the focused attention of a creature that had decided the world required monitoring and intended to do the job properly. He had also learned that Bear was faster than he looked. That Friday afternoon, Owen was at the side of the house, clearing snow from the generator housing, when he heard the back door bang open in a way that meant someone small and confident had gotten through it from the inside. He turned to see Banjo exploding across the backyard at speed, ears flat, feet throwing up snow, pursuing what appeared to be, Owen squinted, a winter squirrel that had made the catastrophic error of crossing the yard. "Banjo," Owen said. His voice carried, but the dog did not. Banjo hit the tree line and vanished, and then Bear shot past Owen's legs like a dark current in the snow, following his brother, not after the squirrel. That was clear from the angle, but directly after Banjo. Head low, body cutting through the white. No hesitation, Owen ran. The pines closed around him within seconds, the world going gray and white and silent, except for the hiss of snow falling from the branches above. He called both names until his throat ached, following tracks that the wind was already starting to erase. Banjo's prints were chaotic, zigzagging with the reckless joy of a dog who had not yet learned that not everything that runs in front of you is safe to follow. Bear's prints ran straight behind them. Owen pushed deeper, moving the way he had been trained to move in poor visibility, methodical and fast, reading the ground. His knee took a root under the snow and he went down hard, came up without pausing. He called again, and again. He was almost at the creek when he heard it. A thin, high sound, almost under the wind, a puppy sound. the kind that came from a dog that was cold and frightened and had only just understood what cold and frightened actually meant. Owen slowed, turned, swept his flashlight low. Banjo was wedged in the hollow beneath a fallen spruce, his black and white coat plastered flat with snow, his eyes dull with the early stages of cold he was too young to understand. He was shaking hard enough to rattle, and pressed against Banjo's back, curved around him with his own dark body turned into the wind, was Bear, rear to the cold, face toward his brother, making himself a wall between Banjo and the weather. His coat was packed with snow. He was shaking too, worse than Banjo, but his eyes were open, and they were watching Owen, and they did not look afraid. Owen knelt down in the snow. His hands moved quickly, gathering first Banjo, then Bear, pulling them both against his chest with the arm strength of a man who had carried heavier things in worse conditions. The cold hit him through his jacket. He did not feel it. He turned toward the house lights, far through the trees. He walked without stopping. The vet in Kelowna, Dr. Ada Fairweather, was 61 and brisk. With close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses, she kept on a chain around her neck and frequently forgot to use. She examined both puppies with the competent efficiency of someone who had been diagnosing cold-stressed animals in interior BC winters for 30 years, asked Owen. 3 pointed questions about the duration of exposure told him that both dogs would be fine, and then looked at him directly over her glasses. "You should have called someone before you went into the trees alone," she said. Owen considered this. There wasn't time. There's always time to call someone. He did not argue, because she was right, and because the particular tone of her voice reminded him of people who had been worried about other people for a long time and were tired of not saying so. Cora Devlin had arrived at the clinic without being asked, having received a text from Nora, who had received a call from Owen, which was apparently how Owen Calloway's emergency network operated. She stood against the wall in the examination room, with her arms crossed, and said nothing while Dr. Fairweather finished, and then said quietly to Owen, "They both made it back." "Yes," Owen said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Both of them," she said again, with a slight change of emphasis that Owen understood and chose not to examine in front of fluorescent lighting. The weeks after the snowstorm rearranged things. Banjo recovered by the next morning and celebrated his recovery by stealing a dishcloth and parading through the house with it, which suggested his perspective on the incident was primarily one of triumph. Bear recovered more slowly, sleeping long hours in the warm corner Owen made for him near the wood stove, accepting the soft food and warm water without his usual hesitation. On the fourth day, while Banjo was attempting to excavate something from beneath the sofa, Bear crossed the room in the unhurried way he had acquired, no longer along the walls, down the middle, and lay across Owen's boots. Owen sat very still. Bear closed his eyes. It was not the conversion moment that movies suggested it should be. No one's life changed in that second. But something that had been tentative became certain. The watching and the being watched and the slow mutual measuring had arrived somewhere, and that somewhere was this. A dog choosing where he felt safe, and the man whose boots he had chosen sitting motionless by the wood stove, afraid to breathe too loud in case the thing was real. Nora came up from Vancouver in December, and the cabin was different when she walked in. She did not say so immediately. She came through the door, and Banjo crashed into her shins at full speed, and she went down to the floor laughing. And then she looked across the room and saw her father sitting at the kitchen table with 2 coffee mugs, as though he had been expecting company. She stood up. She looked at the 2 mugs. "Cora coming?" she said. Owen said nothing, which was its own answer, and Nora's face did the thing it did when she was working very hard not to make a face. Cora arrived an hour later with a bag of the grain-free food Bear had been eating since the vet visit and a box of butter tarts from the bakery in town because, she said, she had been up since 5 and had made poor decisions at the pastry counter. She sat at the table and talked with Nora and Owen in the easy way of someone who had been visiting this kitchen long enough to know where the mugs were. And the late afternoon went slowly and warmly, and outside the snow came off the ridge in small gusts that caught the light from the windows. Owen watched Bear, who was lying near the stove with Banjo asleep across his back, and thought about the February morning 3 years ago when he had sat in a hospital room and held Margaret's hand, and felt the whole quiet architecture of his life come apart. He had not known how to carry that. He had made himself very small inside it. He had moved to a house on a pine road and tried to take up as little space as possible, as though smallness might keep things from breaking further. He thought about what Cora had said months ago about animals understanding where the grief was. He thought about Bear lying in front of a closed door, patient as snow, waiting for a man to find his own way to the knob. Bear opened one eye, looked at Owen across the kitchen, and closed it again. Owen looked at the two mugs on the table. He looked at Nora's face, bright in the lamplight. He looked at Cora's hands around her coffee, unhurried, warm. He had survived 19 years in service. He had survived Margaret. He had survived 3 winters alone in a too-quiet house, calling it peace because he had no better word for what he was doing. What he was doing, he understood now, was waiting, the way Bear had waited. Not because waiting was the answer, but because waiting was the only door a frightened creature knew to stand in front of, hoping something safe would come through it. 2 ridiculous dogs had come through it instead. A woman who did not push. A daughter who drove 6 hours and made appointments without asking permission. An opened room, a photograph in winter light, and the simple, irreducible weight of one dog's warmth against a man's side in the dark. Outside, the ridge caught the last of the afternoon sun and glowed amber through the window. The same color, Owen noticed, as Bear's eyes. Living, he thought, was not surviving in a smaller space. Living was leaving the door open and finding out who came through it. He reached over and refilled Cora's mug without being asked, and she looked up at him with the quiet attention he had come to know as her version of warmth. And outside the snow fell soft and unhurried on the Okanagan hills. And somewhere under the wood stove, Banjo dreamed loudly of squirrels and victory, while Bear lay watchful and warm beside him, keeping his brother company in the dark.